Welcome to another EverybodyHatesCleveland.com podcast. I'm your host, Jim Pete, today joined by Michael Hattery, who I think, Mike, after it's all said and done, after this is probably around our 120th or 130th podcast together, I have to say, of all the potters that I've potted with, you're probably the guy who, quantity at least, you're probably the guy I've potted with the most. That's got to make you feel a little special, right?
So very special. So very special. I get to look at this high-def camera so frequently.
Well, not going to go all ego on this, but I'm kind of easy on the eyes. Mike, we are here to talk about the Indians first and foremost. We're going to go position by position, and normally this would be a long, drawn-out 50-minute podcast, but actually this podcast, if you're listening to it, is the first of many. We're going to talk about literally position by position, starting at catcher, and we'll slowly work our way up to the bullpen to close things out. And this could be something we kill in a week. This could be something that takes us a couple weeks, but it certainly will lead us right up until, well, I guess it can take a couple weeks. We got baseball in a week, but we'll start with catchers. And I know, Mike, obviously there's two guys here to focus on, but I know we want to maybe take this a little bit deeper. But before we get into the catchers, let's big picture this. What are your thoughts, just kind of your general thoughts on the Indians as we kind of close out spring? We got another week of spring before we head to Houston. What are your general thoughts on the Indians this offseason, or this spring training in particular?
I think generally, I think everybody wants to point to Salazar and Floyd as issues, but I think the Indians are leaving in spring training in really, really good shape. We've seen Chris Sale has had an injury that's going to be an issue at the outset of the season. Verlander's having issues. Martinez is having issues. So I think when all's said and done, when the biggest issue is Salazar may spend 5 starts in the minors, or Gavin Floyd, the lotto ticket you purchased, didn't hit, but it was still a goodbye, and that's the worst outcome, you had really good spring training. And I think spring training for a team, when you're set up for contention, is all about making it to opening day with everybody healthy. I know we're going to, people want to say Swisher, but I'm not expecting much production from him anyway. He's not essential to this team's success, and so he can heal slowly, and that's not a big issue. So there are no key injuries, and I think that's a really good sign as they enter April.
Well, that's, we all know baseball season is a season of attrition. The Indians last year, pitching-wise, were fairly healthy as opposed to the year before. It does seem like this team has some depth. You talked about Salazar being down in the minors to come up, and you look position-wise, and a guy like Lindor sitting down there at AAA, and you have other guys that seem to be players that could fill in. You can make a call like on Aguilar, why he was the last player there, but we also have some interesting outfielders. Ramsey comes to mind off the top of my head. Holt comes to mind. The Indians do seem to have some decent depth. Is this a team built to withstand that attrition? If there's a few injuries, this team really can build from within, can't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think there are 1 or 2 positions where obviously the downgrade is huge. And we're going to talk about one of them later, I think. Gomes going down is a huge problem. Gomes is one of the positions where the depth there is just, there's a big, big gap. And you could possibly say that about left just because of the candidacy with Brantley. And I guess you say it about every elite player, but Gomes specifically. But at every other position, it seems like there's sufficient depth, and in many cases the depth deserves almost the same opportunity as the guys with significant guaranteed contracts. So that's really, really exciting. Especially at first and right, there's this kind of feeling that if Swisher wasn't being paid $14 million a year, we could move Ramsey up, we could move Aguilar up, and we wouldn't miss a beat. And so if you just disregard sunk cost with Swisher, it's pretty easy to understand that he's not essential to the Indians this season.
Yeah, and I guess this is probably the most intriguing thing as the year progresses, is maybe the next couple of years progress. And we've talked about this off air plenty of times, Mike. It seems like this team is built not only to withstand injury, but it's also built to last. I hate using the term window, but if the Indians truly, if Mark Shapiro, all those years ago when he talked about windows, now Chris Antonetti, we're truly building a team that could open the window up for a long time. This Indians team certainly looks like it could have a window, an opportunity where this window's open for a long time. Not only with players we see today, but they had a really interesting draft. And I don't want to get into this today. We're going to dive into the catchers in a second. But this window with this current team seems to have a 3 to 4 year lifespan, injuries taking into account, especially with the staff. Is this what Shapiro has been looking for from the start? And I know Antonetti's in power now, but isn't this the ideal situation for a small market team like Cleveland?
Yeah, it's an absolute dream world. I don't think you can have a better outcome. And you know, I think I don't want to get crucified for saying that, because baseball is this uncertainty, and you know, spring training and draft prospects. If you watch, the attrition with young starting pitching is still so high. You know, day after day, it seems like somebody else is going down for Tommy John or elbow surgery, and that's really unfortunate, and it's tough to watch. So I think, but you know, you can only get so far when you're a small market team and setting up a situation. And the Indians have the perfect small market situation right now. And whatever happens after this is really out of their control. But getting to this point is truly impressive. And then supplementing skillfully is the next test. And I think that's something that over the last year or two has been, maybe a criticism, is that supplementing hasn't been done particularly well, and maybe Swisher and Bourne contracts have blocked the door on how you can supplement this roster right now. But I think supplementing is the next step.
And one name I kind of want to throw out there too in this supplementing thing, and as you kind of look through these names, we mentioned Lindor, Ramsey, Aguilar. They even have a guy like Sean Markham, Bruce Chen, even a guy like Carlos Moncrief, who we're familiar with from our days at IBI. He seems to get better and better as the as the years progress. I mean, this is a guy who I believe is 26. But also another guy who I think could supplement quite well. Seems to have some tools that could play at the major league level.
Yeah, Moncrief, if you knock those 2 years off from when he was a pitcher and look at his progression age-wise in terms of his development, he's right on path. I mean, last year he raked in AAA, showed everything he needed to. Essentially, if you take 2 years off, he's a 24-year-old producing well at AAA. He's a guy who just had a good spring. So absolutely, I think the Indians are in a really tough spot. And I think Aguilar and Moncrief specifically are in a really tough spot in terms of this door, because I think it's unfortunate that neither Ramsey or Moncrief got an option, or Holt really, to supplement this team, because the Indians are committed to guys that they're paying money right now, and what's coming up behind them is Brad Zimmer, Frazier, Naquin to a lesser extent, guys who really have so much more priority in the system. So I think the unfortunate thing, which is fortunate if you're the Indians, is that they're loaded with depth, and some of these guys are going to get lost in the shuffle.
A good problem to have, and of course, as we get into that trading season, which hopefully the Indians will be players on the positive side of that, it looks like they'll definitely have some collateral to use. At least some of these minor league guys could certainly be pieces that maybe push a deal over the top. And as we work through this lineup, I suspect we're going to come across possible trade candidates. We won't today, at least with this particular podcast at catcher, because there isn't a guy that we're going to mention that's going to get dealt. But as we talk first base and get into that middle infield, I think the Indians have some really interesting decisions that are going to be made as the year progresses that will help this team this year. And potentially affect it in years to come. But we'll get there when we get there. Mike, let's go ahead and dive into this. Obviously, a catcher, the starting catcher for the Indians is Yan Gomes, who's become more or less a cult hero in Cleveland at this point, with several of the popular fans, all the kids sitting at the good table seem to love Yan Gomes, and this isn't really an out of the blue kind of thing. But I can't help but think back to April of last year, Mike, and if you go back there with me, if I recall correctly, it seemed like the city of Cleveland was ready to to lift the lid off of Jan Gomes and throw him out of town. If you recall, last April he struggled, and there were a lot of people who thought he was a one-hit wonder. My, oh my, how things have changed. This year he really seems like the guy that everybody points to as being one of their favorite players, at least. It's deservedly so, Mike. But wait, before we dive into the nuts and bolts of Jan Gomes, are you on that Jan Gomes bandwagon as well? And is this a guy who's here to stay, or can we still see some regression?
Yeah, I think entering 2014, I think a lot of people, especially advanced people who value things like BABIP, were pretty skeptical. There aren't a lot of true talent 340 BABIP guys in Major League Baseball. And at Gomes, he posted a high BABIP again, which gives us a lot more confidence in him and his ability to kind of make that his true talent BABIP, which is batting average on balls in play. It's essentially your ability to outcomes on balls in play. So Gomes is really he's just the other piece with him is that it was still hard to believe that we could acquire one of the 5 best catchers in baseball for Esmiel Rogers, for a flaky middle relief pitcher who got turned into a starter for a couple, and I believe got DFA'd in the last 6 months. I'm a card-carrying member. I'm not Kevin Dean. I'm not Al Chimichella. I haven't driven the bandwagon on Jan Gomes, but I can tell you how good Jan Gomes is. And whether you look at WAR or whether you just look at his skill in every category. The only real knock on Jan Gomes is he doesn't walk enough. But defensively, he's a very good blocker. He's a plus pitch framer, which is something we're starting to value more and more and understand its value in terms of grading players defensively. His arm is incredible. I think one of the most exciting things to watch as run scoring is deflated is if you can watch these really good defenders. And watching Jan Gomes catch is a really, really fun experience, especially watching him throw the ball. And he provides pop from the right side. 20 homers, 50-plus extra base hits. That's a lot. So he's a top 5 catcher. He's better than Salvador Perez, whatever people think. They own him for 5 more years, 6 more years with options. Can't have a better outcome.
Well, the funny thing about the catcher position, I think, in Major League Baseball is they're still. I mean, he's still not a name. When you talk about dark horse catchers, I think the first name that always comes up is Jonathan LaCroix for the Brewers. And no knock on LaCroix, I love him. Great player. He's probably the face of that team right now. But certainly Jan Gomes is in the same breath as LaCroix. I don't have their numbers sitting up side by side. What will it take for Gomes to get noticed this year? Or is this the nature of the beast for the Indians? And I mean, I know looking at the national, there's a national spotlight on the Indians, but let's get real. I mean, if you look back to last year, basically Corey Kluber was a nondescript person. He won the Cy Young because he was so unstoppable the second half of the year, but he didn't even get into the All-Star game. Is Jan Gomes just one of those guys that's going to be overlooked by the national pundits, but is going to be one of those players that shouldn't be? Is this a guy who's going to have maybe not MVP caliber seasons, but well, maybe he is going to have MVP caliber season? I don't know. I mean, when you talk about pitch framing, Mike, and I'll let you talk about that a little more extensively here in a second. When you talk about this pitching staff, a lot of credit is given to Mickey Callaway. A lot of credit is given to Tito Francona. But isn't there a direct correlation between the some of these pitchers' improvement and Jan Gomes being their starting catcher?
Absolutely, and I think the way pitch framing is really challenging because in many ways what's out there, especially what's open access right now, as the Indians currently employ probably one of the 3 best analysts at pitch framing, somebody who drove the frontier, Max Marchi. It's pretty clear that they picked him up for a purpose. So unfortunately, that proprietary information is not going to reach us. But from what we understand, how we value pitch framing, I think some of the numbers tossed out there in terms of its effect on a ball game have been pretty extreme. I don't completely buy in, but there's something substantive there. There's some substantive effect, especially when you move from Carlos Santana, who we rag on him defensively, but especially in terms of pitch framing and receiving and the plate, he was challenged. So when you move to someone who's below average to someone who's significantly above average, that marginal value gap is huge. And it's an obvious improvement for guys like Carrasco, to control the strike zone. So I think that's a huge element. When we talk about Gomes as an MVP level player, I mean, he posted a near 5 WAR season, which is, he was a top 25 value player last year. So that's an MVP candidate. The problem is defense only matters to people when it looks really ugly. People don't really care about defense unless you're booting balls around the infield. They don't notice. They don't talk about it, and it never comes into play in MVP debates. We saw this when Miguel Cabrera won an MVP award over Mike Trout. Possibly the worst defensive third baseman in baseball took an MVP award over an elite defender at center. So defense, guys who a lot of value comes from their defense are often really undervalued. And I think that's kind of the curse of Yan Gomes. And ultimately, I think that could be a long-term curse of Francisco Lindor, which I kind of worry about for Indians fans. I think there's some expectations about his bat because he's a top prospect that are unfair to Lindor. Not that he won't have a good bat for short, or above average bat for short, but a lot of his value is defensive. And my concern is that long-term, people don't value defense enough. And so they'll kind of be disappointed in what they see when what they're seeing is a really fine baseball player.
Well, Cleveland's an interesting town. Most of us grew up watching one of the greats at shortstop, very nondescript shortstop, as non-Ozzie Smith as you can get. Ozzie Smith, of course, is flamboyant shortstop, backflips and all of that. Omar Vizquel did his job and was kind of a blue-collar version of Ozzie Smith. And I wonder, as we basically rode Johnny Peralta out of this town, Mr. Offense, I guess, compared to Omar Vizquel, and we could argue that point actually because Vizquel is a better offensive player than people give him credit for. But then we end up with this Drupal Cabrera, who is an interesting debate whether or not he was good or not, and we've kind of chuckled at what some people have said about him over the years. As we move towards, and now we got J-Ram, who many are ripping on because he is the anti-Cabrera and can play some defense. Of course, you and I have chuckled about that as well. Lindor's the kind of cat that kind of fits that Omar Vizquel model. And when you look at Yan Gomes, as I said way back to him, he seems to fit that model as well. It's interesting, Mike. You talked to me about a week ago. We were talking about pitch framing, just kind of offhandedly in a text discussion. And this, I think, over this past spring, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like this pitch framing has become a big deal. I was reading an article this morning about Jonathan LaCroix, as a matter of fact, talking about pitch framing, about how a case could be made once the value of pitch framing is taken into account, that a guy like LaCroix, based on the money that he's making, he'll make $3 million this year, is a bigger value to his team because of how he handles his pitching staff, pitch frame-wise, than a guy like Mike Trout. And I know that's a big statement, but monetarily this year, $3 million to whatever Trout's making, I don't know offhand. I know it's a lot. That seems to be a valid point. Now, Yan Gomes certainly fits into this equation. Is Yan Gomes' value truly immeasurable right now as we try to grasp the pitch framing aspect, as we try to grasp kind of this new metric, and how he has affected this pitching staff? I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that of the 270 strikeouts that Corey Kluber had last year, Gomes played a part in some of those. Obviously, Gomes played a part in Carlos Carrasco's resurgence. Obviously, Gomes played a part in Trevor Bauer balancing himself. And certainly, as Salazar moves up through this system again, I think Gomes will play a part in that. How can that be valued right now?
Yeah, I think WAR is awesome because I think it allows us to do something, to have something, some sort of number, no matter how imperfect, that it represents like 80% of what a player's value is, and there's a lot of room there. Anybody that tells you that WAR is a really good comparative stat is, it's very easy to overvalue it. I think they're tremendous. I love WAR. I think it's awesome, especially when you're talking about contract value. But when we get to pitch framing, it's really, really challenging to consider the effects of pitch framing, especially the variability of an individual pitch frame. But we can say that, like, if you are in a 1-0 count versus an 0-1 count, the OBP differential there is almost 100 points. I mean, it's huge. It's dynamic. So swinging 1 or 2 pitches a baseball game can sometimes swing 1 or 2 outs a baseball game. So swinging an out a baseball game, if a catcher adds an out to your pitcher a baseball game, while that seems really micro, it has really dynamic macro effects. But ascribing some value to that, individual instance is really, really challenging, and weighting that instance correctly is challenging. But I do think there's a really, really solid case to be made that pitch framing is 25% of what a catcher does, or 20% of what he does defensively. Maybe more, maybe 40 to 50%. And if so, that really changes how we value catchers. For instance, Salvador Perez is widely considered as a solid defensive catcher. He's really bad at it. He's awful. He's one of the worst in the league. And how does that shift it? That right there sets Gomes miles ahead of Perez. So, and the manner in which you can affect the pitching staff. So it's different. We'll see how it gets added to metrics like WAR and run value metrics. The runs above average is interesting, but a little more. I don't have a complete grasp of how it'll be incorporated and how large we can really assess that effect.
I think it'll be a fun watch over the next couple of years. I mean, obviously, the Indians have wrapped him up. He'll be our catcher for we talked about that window, and the Indians have him tied up for the next 4. It'll be fun watching him develop over the coming years and to see if he can improve upon what he's already done last year. Fantastic season, of course, and really kind of the immeasurable guy there. And truly, Yan Gomes, an MVP to many. So I guess a shout out to Kevin Dean and a shout out to Al. I guess today's show is for you, but we're not done there. I think a guy that got overlooked last year who kind of stepped up midway through the season was Roberto Perez. For us minor league kind of beatniks, like I've been over the past few years, Roberto Perez was always a favorite. I saw him catch I can't remember exactly how it went, Mike, but I believe he caught like an 18-inning game and then pitched like parts of a doubleheader that happened the day after that. I'll have to look back at the stats, but ever since then, he's always been a favorite of mine. When he was in Kinston, Carolina, he was the guy who. He was a guy who I liked. He was a very streaky hitter, but defensively he was spoken about almost like Francisco Lindor, about maybe more like Giovanni Urshela, a guy who had a glove that was major league ready, but had a pencil for a bat. He hit the ball last year with the Indians. It was certainly a surprise there, but Perez to me is the perfect backup. You talk about framing. He seems to mirror Yan Gomes in a lot of ways. Seems to have a veteran presence, knows how to handle pitchers. Will never really command for the number 1 job, but certainly could be a number 1 catcher defensively if the Indians need him to be. Is Roberto Perez the perfect backup catcher?
Yeah, I think I look for a couple of things when I look for a backup catcher. I think when you're in a role where you're going to play 40 or 50 games a year, expecting stability with the bat is unfair. But if you have a good eye, if you have a good OBP skill, and while it didn't show at the big league level, traditionally his walk rates have been really, really strong. I think they're going to bounce back a little bit this year in the big leagues. And a guy, if you're comfortable with the pitching staff, and if moving from one catcher to the other doesn't have any difference on the comfort level of the pitching staff, I think that's really huge. And Perez gives you that. And you can't expect much more than that. You'd love to have the Victor and Kelly Shopik thing again, except, Victor couldn't catch, nor could Kelly, but they were good bats back there. I'm sure everybody would like that, but I prefer what we have right now.
Yeah, and I who would have thought 3 years ago that our starting catcher would be Yan Gomes and our backup catcher would be Roberto Perez, and we'd be happy about it. Now we might have the best fit tandem in baseball. Before we talk about where these two guys, Yan Gomes in particular, rank amongst these other major league catchers, I know, Mike, there's a guy you want to talk about. I don't mind talking about him either. You got into an interesting discussion last night a couple nights ago about the Indians, in particular Shapiro and Antonetti, and maybe what they look in and bringing players into this organization IQ-wise. It's pretty clear Yan Gomes has a high IQ. It's clear Roberto Perez has that same baseball IQ, understands how to play the game. Is there another guy that intrigues you in this system that plays catcher, Mike? I suspect there is. This is kind of a horrible segue into this because we actually talked about this, but who's that other guy you'd like to talk about?
I'd like to talk about Tony Walters. Tony Walters is really interesting because, to me, he seems like he's a really high effort guy. He's an excellent preparer, and you've spent a lot more time watching him and how he prepares and the effort he puts in. But everything I've heard in terms of his work ethic and the quality of person is just off the charts. And so the transition to catcher to me is really, really interesting, especially with the pitch framing move in the marketplace. I mean, the Indians have two really good ones right now in Gomes and Perez. They have probably the authority, the analytical authority on pitch framing on their staff, on their analytics staff. And Tony Walters gets moved to catcher last year and posts the second highest minors pitch framing data, the second highest rating after in his second year behind the plate, and that's really interesting to me. And I kind of wonder how that happened. He had really limited catching experience before that, my feeling is I think the Indians. This was a really creative move. This is a move that nobody expected. Nobody saw coming. Walters didn't see it coming. Walter didn't, never crossed Walter's mind, but he put in effort. And his development is really interesting. Just based on his pitch framing skill, his receiving skills, he looks like a major league player. And the possibility of having a guy who can back up at catcher, short, and second base offers versatility that is so rare. And I know Chris Jimenez exists, but he stinks. But it shows you how valuable managers think that sort of versatility is. And while Walters will never offer much with the stick, playing 50 games a year, being emergency depth at three positions, and playing them well with the glove. I think one of the things that is irritating with a guy like Mike Aviles is he plays second, he plays short, he plays third, and he puts on an outfield glove every once in a while. He doesn't necessarily do it that well. And having a guy who can play those positions competently defensively is a big deal. And that's why Walters is so interesting. And Walters, the project, in terms of pitch framing, is really interesting to see if the Indians think that this is not an innate skill, but a skill that can be trained and a skill that can be improved. And where having a tabula rasa, a blank slate, is valuable in terms of teaching this skill is really interesting.
Well, I can tell many Tony Walters stories, and for people who follow the team, he's always one of the top 3 or 4 guys that people mention as far as makeup goes. I mean, this is a guy who understands the game of baseball, has family support, and clearly knows how to field. Defensively, he's been above average at every position that he's played, and then he's played, of course, up the middle positions, second base and shortstop, and has even played a little outfield. But of course, the move to catcher was such a surprise. He literally was asked, and there's definitely documentation of this, but he literally was asked right prior to the start of the season and to move to catcher, and did after having a discussion with his family. Decided it was the best move. Went down for a little over a month and was back up in Carolina playing catcher. And I just that alone, Mike, doing it for one, agreeing to it for one, is special in a lot of ways. Being able to make it back to the team prior to the All-Star break is pretty special. And then to be effective, I recall a game that season, I want to say it was in July, where he threw out 3 base runners in a game. Now, for a catcher who's been catching for a season or 2 seasons or 10 seasons, throwing out 3 in a game is pretty special. for doing it for maybe a month, like that's really special, and it kind of speaks to what kind of player that he is. Now, certainly, you're talking about one of those high IQ guys, and we've been talking about this, Mike, you and I especially, for the past 2 years since we talked about a guy like Brantley, but Wolters to me is an interesting guy in that if they do bring him up at some point to be a backup catcher or to be a starter at somewhere, he certainly could fit the bill in a lot of different places. Someone joked around today that maybe the ultimate Sabre player is Wolters, because this is a guy who legitimately could play every position and maybe even pitch if they asked him to. But it'll be interesting to see what their goals are for him. Is he ultimately the guy they want to bring him to back up? Is he a guy that they want to bring in as a super utility? I'm curious, but he certainly is one to watch this year. I believe he's starting the year off at Akron. I don't think he'll be there very long. The Indians have a history of having some veterans there at Columbus. But Wolters is a guy who spent 2 seasons in Carolina and is in Akron now. I wouldn't be surprised to see him in Columbus, come mid-year and be a legitimate factor should any of the catchers go down, and they need a long-term fill-in. My guess is next year, Mike, when we talk about catchers, we'll be talking about him a little more permanently. This year, he will be fun watch to develop, because you got to figure after a year and 3 quarters of playing the position now of catcher, this will be the year where we get to see him actually play the position instead of learn the position, wouldn't you think?
Yeah, this is really interesting to me will be whether his reps will be solely a catcher or whether he'll play 5 games at second and 5 games at short as well. I think play distribution. Also, the other piece to me that's really interesting is, I think a lot of times when we see transitions, positional transitions specifically, especially ones that are highly challenging. I mean, catcher is a highly challenging position. There's so many facets you have to learn in terms of calling a game, pitching and receiving, blocking balls. There's so much there. I think that we could see, once he feels more comfortable behind the dish, and it looks like he's very comfortable behind it. Now we can see if the bat kind of steps forward with it, if he can relax, and if the bat can kind of progress as well. So I think there's not a ton in there, but if the bat gets a little more interesting and seeing where he plays positionally, whether he plays 130 behind the plate or 120 behind the plate and 10 in the infield, will be really interesting.
And certainly something to watch. And, guys like you and I, Mike, who will pay an intimate attention to the minor league system this year, Wolters is certainly someone, a top 10 guy in the system, who will keep an eye on as the year progresses. All right, let's kind of wrap things up, Mike, and let's talk where Gomes fits overall into the Major League pantheon of catchers. I think when you talk the top catchers in the game, the first 2 guys that pop into your mind are Posey, of course, and Molina. I've already mentioned a guy like LaCroix. You mentioned Perez from Kansas City. A guy we haven't mentioned yet is Russell Martin. You've got a couple of other guys in there. Mesoraco's in there, I'm sure. McCann's in there. Where does Gomes fit? I mean, certainly he's top 10. I think you can argue top 5. I don't know that because of body of work you can put him up there with Posey and Molino, or even maybe LaCroix, but do you think he's a top 5 guy?
I think he's top 3. I think the only 2 catchers here I think are going to be better are LaCroix and Posey. Molina has a tremendous body of work, but body of work, he also has, he's aging. And I think we're reaching a point of decline, I think, at this point with Molina. So I think Posey and LaCroix are the only guys that look substantively, you can say they're better than Gomes. And Gomes and Posey are pretty close last year, so he's really friggin'
good. I really honestly can't top that. I'm just going to leave that be, Mike. I'm not even going to make you plug anything. How about that? You get a treat. No plugs.
I will plug the. I will say that there's some really awesome content up today. I think Nick did a really cool analysis that you're not going to see anywhere else. And I think that ultimately we're not going to break news and we're not going to write a lot of game recaps, but if you want to come day after day for people who are very thoughtful, very analytical, and very contemplative about what they write about, this is the place to go. And that's what matters. So I'll plug that. Check it out. There's really good stuff up there right now, and none of it's mine. So that's how you know it's good stuff. So give it a read.
Well, and just to kind of follow up on that, I was a writer at Indians Baseball Insider and an editor there for 5 years and enjoyed my time there. And when I left, I really wasn't sure what I was going to do. And Mike and Steve Urbanik and myself, we kind of volleyed around the internet a little bit for a few months before we opened up Everybody Hates Cleveland. We didn't really have a direction at the beginning, but about 3 months ago, I think the one theme that kind of stood out to all three of us, really there were two. One was just kind of this family aspect where we were writing with people who we actually care about, and I don't mean that. I feel like violin music should start playing there. Maybe I'll feed that in. But I can't say enough how fun it is to get on Twitter and to have conversations with guys that I can break their balls, or I can talk about serious things, and baseball in particular, but of course the Cavs and the Browns and movies and TV. And these are guys I truly think, or I truly can call friends, truly guys I'd sit and have a beer with at a bar. And I just want to throw that out there because this isn't going away anytime soon. Now, what's going to be up on our site, again, I already mentioned it earlier, but the reality of the situation is we don't know. I want people to write about what they care about. And if it turns out to be the Indians and we have 35 guys writing about Yan Gomes, then that's the way it's going to be. I figure if these guys write about Yan Gomes, that's what people want to see. So I don't know from day to day what we're going to write about. We do have daily discussions online with each other about what that could be, but truthfully, I just kind of let it go, and if somebody has something to post, they post it. And that's just the way it's been. So, all I can tell you is this. We're going to write about what we care about. It's usually going to be long form, but if it's a 5-sentence piece, I'm okay with that. That's just the way it is. What you're not going to get is you're not going to get cookie-cutter stuff. And again, I mean, there's so much good content out there, WFNY, IBI. You can go on and on and on and on with the good content out there. But I think what you'll see, and I'm not just throwing like random names out there. These are names that have been around the internet for a long, long time. I'm not looking for endorsements or anything like that. But I care about it. Check it out, EHC. Give us a follow at EVRYBDY hates CLE on Twitter. Of course, you can follow Mike and me, and you can figure out where we're at because we post a lot. So we'll be there, and we'll be potting fairly regularly from this point on. I know I say that every time, and then we don't. This time we will. So talking catchers now, and first base next. Have a good one. Go Cleveland. Sorry, Mike. Do you want to say something before we go?
No, I'm good. I'm good.
I can ramble, man. All right. We'll see you next time.